Picture this: you're sipping your morning coffee, flipping through bills, and your electricity statement looks like you've been running a secret Bitcoin mine in your garage. That's where I found myself, Mason, a 55-year-old data analyst who just wants to crunch numbers in peace, not bankroll my neighbor's backyard Cirque du Soleil. My house sits in a tidy HOA community, the kind where every lawn is mowed to military precision, and the mailboxes all match. Life was quiet, until my electric bill started climbing faster than gas prices in an election year. We're talking $200, $300, then $450 a month. For a guy who's basically a human light switch, off by 10 p.m., this was nuts. So, I grabbed the latest bill off my kitchen counter, its numbers screaming like a horror movie budget. Something was wrong. I fired up my security systems app, because if you're gonna live in an HOA, you better have cameras to catch the Karens in action. Hours of footage later, I hit pay dirt. There she was, Patricia, our HOA president, late 50s, dressed like she's auditioning for Real Housewives of Suburbia. This woman, who once fined me $50 for a non-compliant mailbox flag, was sneaking into my yard like a power-hungry raccoon. Every evening, she'd unplug my garden hose timer and snake an orange extension cord from my outdoor outlet to her property. That cord powered her Vegas-worthy garden lights, a gurgling koi pond, and, get this, her volunteer landscaping crew's leaf blowers and hedge trimmers. Daily. 4 months. Now, Patricia's yard is the neighborhood's Taj Mahal, petunias so perfect they look photoshopped, fountains that could headline at the Bellagio. She calls it community beautification. I call it theft. My outlet, my juice, her party. I figured I'd be the bigger man. Caught her one afternoon, her clipboard in hand like she's directing a Spielberg epic, while her crew buzzed away on my dime. Patricia, I said, calm as a monk, you're using my electricity. That's my private outlet. You need to stop. She flicked her wrist like I was a gnat. Oh, Mason, don't be so stingy. It's for the community. That outlet's practically on the property line. Consider it your donation. Then she smirked, turned back to her crew, and cranked the leaf blower louder. Donation? Lady, I'm not running a charity for your glow-in-the-dark begonias. I stood there, the orange cord mocking me, her clipboard listing beautification projects that apparently included my wallet. So, guys, what would you do? March over and yank the cord? Slap her with the bill? Call the sheriff? Drop your ideas in the comments. How do you deal with a neighbor who thinks your stuff is their personal buffet? Here's where it gets juicy. That outlet? It's not your standard plug-and-play. The previous owner, some eco-nerd genius, rewired it to a special circuit tied to my septic system's aeration motor and emergency pump. Yeah, my septic system's fancier than most people's cars. It's got a failsafe, pulled too much power for too long, like, say, a nightly garden gala, and it triggers a pressure release to avoid a tank explosion. Where does that release go? Straight to a drainage swale, which just happens to border Patricia's prize petunia bed, an unpermitted upgrade she bullied the HOA into ignoring. I dug out the old property schematics, laminated like a sacred scroll, and there it was, the outlet's weird wiring, clear as day. Patricia had no clue she was plugging her parties into a ticking poop bomb. Last night, I caught her stringing up even more lights for her big, twilight garden tour. My septic panel's already flashing yellow, whining about the strain. Alright, Patricia, I muttered, eyeing the diagnostics. You want my power? Let's see how much you can handle before things get messy. Patricia thought my polite request to stop siphoning my electricity was just me blowing smoke. She didn't know her garden extravaganza was wired to a septic time bomb, and I was about to set the clock. In my home office, I turned into a one-man CSI unit. I saved every damning clip from my security cameras, logging the exact times Patricia's extension cord invaded my outlet. My electric bills, stacked like a bad poker hand, showed the cost of her community spirit. The real kicker. My septic system's control panel app on my tablet was throwing up load errors and pressure warnings every time she plugged in her light show. I cross-referenced the system's technical manuals, confirming what I suspected: a sustained power draw like hers would trip the failsafe, sending a special delivery right to her Petunia Palace. I wasn't about to let her gaslight me into footing the bill. I typed up a formal complaint to the HOA board, attaching photos, videos, and a timeline of her theft. I CC'd every member, figuring even Patricia's loyal minions might blink at hard evidence. At the next HOA meeting, she didn't disappoint. As president, she waved off my complaint like it was a bad Yelp review. Petty, she called it, claiming some fictional, informal agreement for using my outlet and insisting it was community accessible because it was near the property line. Total BS. She strong-armed the board into tabling my complaint, smirking as she declared, "I'm the president, so it stands." The meeting minutes, which I snagged later, read like a love letter to her ego. I kept the pressure on. One last time, I confronted her while she was prepping for her Twilight Garden tour, her yard already glowing like a low-rent Disneyland. "Patricia, stop using my outlet," I said, voice like steel. "I'll report this to the city for unauthorized electrical load if you don't." She laughed, actually laughed, saying, "You should thank me for using your dead space." Game on. That night, I dove into my septic system's advanced settings. The load stress was already redlining from her pre-party setup. Instead of shutting it down, I tweaked the failsafe threshold, setting it just high enough to tolerate her current draw but guaranteeing that her gala's extra lights, speakers, and whatever else she'd plug in would push it over the edge. For fun, I linked the pressure sensors to a digital countdown on my monitor, ticking down to the moment her party would get a very unwelcome guest. Patricia's Twilight Garden tour was in full swing, her backyard sparkling like a budget Vegas strip, music pulsing, guests in wide-brimmed hats sipping overpriced wine. She had no clue the main event was bubbling beneath her prize-winning begonias, ready to douse her dreams with a stench that'd make a skunk gag. By Saturday afternoon, her yard was a spectacle. Extension cords slithered from my outlet like a power-hungry hydra, feeding strings of twinkling lights, a sound system blaring elevator jazz, fountains gurgling like they were auditioning for a meditation app, and electric warmers keeping the quiche from congealing. Her volunteer crew, probably strong-armed with threats of HOA fines, buzzed around tweaking floral arrangements and polishing her ego. The air carried lavender, perfume, and the faint whiff of her entitlement. I planted myself on my porch, sinking into my chair with a prime view of the circus. My phone, propped on a tripod, quietly recorded every glittering detail for the evidence vault, or maybe a viral post, depending on the night's chaos. My tablet's septic system app glowed with a pressure gauge creeping toward the danger zone, each new plug from Patricia's setup nudging it closer to critical. Another strand of fairy lights here, a fog machine for mood, there, she was piling on the load like a kid maxing out a credit card. I could have flipped the override switch, saved her from herself. But after months of her smirks, theft, and HOA bullying, I was more inclined to let nature take its course. As dusk settled, the party hit its peak. Guests mingled, clinking glasses, fawning over Patricia's petunias like they were museum pieces. She climbed onto a makeshift stage, just a spruced-up garden bench, microphone in hand, channeling her inner talk show host. "Welcome, friends, to our Twilight Garden tour," she crowed, her voice thick with self-admiration. "This is about community spirit, about beautiful living, about elevating our neighborhood." The crowd applauded, blissfully unaware her elevation was running on my stolen juice. I glanced at my tablet. The pressure gauge was teetering on the edge, the system's warnings flashing like a fire alarm. Patricia rambled on about curb appeal as a civic duty, her fountains bubbling, her lights blazing brighter than her hubris. The system was seconds from snapping, the pressure building with every beat of her jazz playlist. I leaned back, cracked a beer, and savored the calm before the storm. Then it came. A low gurgle, like the ground was gargling mouthwash, rumbled from the drainage swale by Patricia's petunia bed. It started soft, drowned out by saxophones and chatter, but grew into a deep, menacing growl. A few guests near the refreshment table froze, sniffing the air, their noses wrinkling. The system was at its breaking point, ready to blow any moment. With a wet, roaring whoosh, a geyser of septic overflow burst from the swale, spraying murky water and unmentionable muck across Patricia's pristine lawn. It shot out like a low-rent Old Faithful, drenching her petunias, soaking a table of hors d'oeuvres, and splattering the shoes of a dozen horrified guests. Screams erupted. The jazz cut off, the sax player fumbling his horn as he retched. Guests stumbled over each other, clutching their faces, some slipping on the now slick grass. A lady in a sun hat dropped her wineglass, wailing, "What is that?" Patricia stood frozen mid-speech, her microphone amplifying a gasp that could have shattered glass. A clump of something foul hit her white blazer, and she swatted at it, shrieking like she'd been stung. The geyser kept flowing, turning her garden into a swampy disaster zone. Her begonias sagged, the refreshment table looked like a biohazard site, and her fountain sputtered under the deluge. Her husband, a quiet guy who usually just trailed her like a shadow, sprinted over with a garden hose, trying to rinse her off behind a trellis. It was like trying to mop up a tsunami with a napkin. Pandemonium took over. Guests fled, abandoning purses and plates, their dress shoes squelching in the muck. A kid in a bow tie sobbed as his mom yanked him toward their car. Patricia, unhinged, stormed my way, her hair plastered with something I won't name. "You," she bellowed, jabbing a finger. "You sabotaged my gala. You endangered us all." Her face was a mix of fury and filth, her voice cracking like a bad radio. I stayed cool, lounging in my chair, my phone still capturing the meltdown in glorious HD. "Patricia," I said, smooth as a used car salesman, "I told you to stop overloading my outlet. You ignored me. That's not sabotage, that's consequences." Her jaw dropped, but all she managed was a sputter, echoing the dying gurgles from the swale. She kept ranting, each accusation wilder than the last. "You rigged that system," she screamed, as if I'd spent my weekends building a sewage bazooka just for her. "You'll be sued, Mason. You'll pay for this." The remaining guests gawked, some snapping photos, probably for the neighborhood gossip mill. Her husband, still hosing her down, looked like he was mentally drafting divorce papers. I didn't flinch. My footage had it all, the cords, the lights, the eruption, her tantrum. The septic logs on my tablet marked the exact second her gala pushed the system over the edge. She could yell all she wanted, the truth was buried in my data, and it smelled worse than her yard. As she stomped back to her ruined party, barking at her husband to call the board, I sipped my beer and let the chaos burn itself out. The night air, heavy with the stink of her defeat, carried the last of her guests' hurried exits. Her garden, once her crown jewel, was a soggy crime scene. Me. I just sat there, my porch chair creaking, knowing the real fight was coming, and I was loaded for bear. Patricia thought she could pin her sewage-soaked soiree on me, screaming sabotage to anyone who'd listen. She didn't know her unpermitted improvements and my septic system's data logs were about to flush her authority straight down the drain. The morning after the gala, a violation notice from Patricia landed in my mailbox, accusing me of deliberate environmental sabotage and endangering the community. I nearly choked on my coffee, laughing at the gall. Did she think she could bully her way out of this mess? I got to work, pulling together a defense tighter than a banker's wallet. My lawyer, a guy who loves a good underdog fight, was already on speed dial. I also fired off preemptive reports to the county health department and environmental protection agency, attaching my arsenal, security footage of Patricia's cord-snaking antics, electric bills that screamed theft, septic system logs pinpointing her overload, the original property schematics showing the outlet's quirky setup, and every warning I'd sent her and the HOA. My evidence binder was thicker than a phone book, with her violation notice slapped on top like a cherry of irony. The county didn't waste time. Within days, a team of investigators, health, environmental, and building code folks, rolled up in their logoed vans, clipboards in hand. They pored over my logs and schematics, their eyebrows climbing as I walked them through the septic system's failsafe and how Patricia's power grab triggered it. Their interest spiked when I pointed out her unpermitted drainage swale and gravel pit, a landscaping flex she'd rammed through without a single county approval. That swale, so effective at channeling my septic overflow into her yard, might have violated protected buffer zones or screwed up local drainage patterns. One inspector, a grizzled guy with a nose for BS, muttered, "This is gonna be a problem." Patricia's facade cracked faster than cheap drywall. When the investigators questioned her, her story zigzagged like a drunk driver. She claimed the outlet was shared community property, lie, insisted she had my verbal permission, bigger lie, and doubled down on her sabotage accusations, painting me as some mad scientist with a vendetta. But she couldn't explain the security footage, the electric bills, or why she'd ignored my repeated warnings. Her sabotage claims wilted against my data, like her petunias under the septic spray. The investigators left her stammering, their notebooks filled with enough red flags to start a parade. The HOA board, smelling the fallout, called an emergency meeting. The room was tense, the air thick with the dread of potential fines and lawsuits. Patricia's usual allies, the spineless types who'd nodded along to her every whim, were suddenly less loyal. My lawyer and I walked in armed with the evidence binder, laying out the case like a courtroom drama. I showed the footage, the bills, the logs, and the schematics, tying every gurgle to Patricia's greed. The county sent a preliminary findings report, hinting at serious violations tied to her unpermitted landscaping and the spill's environmental impact. One board member, a retired accountant who'd always looked cowed by Patricia, finally spoke up, "You caused this. You ignored him." Patricia tried to rally, banging her gavel and insisting she'd acted in the community's best interest. But the room wasn't buying it. Her dismissal of my HOA complaint, her lies about agreements, and her bullying tactics were laid bare. The county's report was the final nail, suggesting her swale might have worsened the spill by funneling it into a sensitive drainage zone. The board, facing their own liability for letting her run unchecked, started whispering about votes and resignations. Patricia's reign was crumbling, and she knew it. Her face, usually a mask of smug control, twitched with the realization that her throne was made of quicksand. I sat back, letting the chaos unfold. My lawyer fielded questions from the board, his calm precision cutting through Patricia's deflections. The investigators' findings weren't final, but they were damning enough to shift the room's mood. Neighbors who'd stayed silent for years started murmuring, some even nodding my way. Patricia's power, built on intimidation and clipboard waving, was evaporating faster than the stench from her ruined garden. By the meeting's end, the board was drafting motions to review her presidency and tighten oversight on future projects. Patricia stormed out, muttering about ungrateful neighbors, but the damage was done. My binder, now the stuff of HOA legend, had turned her from queen to cautionary tale. The county was still digging, and their next report promised to dig deeper into her landscaping sins. I left the meeting with a quiet satisfaction, knowing the real cleanup was just getting started, and it wasn't my yard on the chopping block. Patricia's reign didn't end with a bang but with the gurgle of a backed-up septic tank and the rustle of legal papers. The air in the neighborhood finally started to clear, in more ways than one. The county came down hard. Patricia was slapped with fines that could have funded a small startup, penalties for her unpermitted drainage swale, environmental violations from the spill, and a bill for the hazardous cleanup of her once pristine yard. Her petunias were gone, her fountains dismantled, her lawn a churned-up mess of remediation equipment. I filed a civil suit, nailing her for electricity theft, damage to my septic system from her overload, harassment, and defamation for that laughable violation notice. My lawyer, grinning like a kid on Christmas, said it was the easiest case he'd ever prepped. Patricia's reputation, once polished to a HOA sheen, was now as tarnished as her sewage-stained blazer. The board, spooked by their own liability, started proceedings to boot her as president, her gavel days numbered. The HOA wasn't off the hook either. The county's report suggested they'd been negligent, rubber-stamping Patricia's projects and ignoring my complaints. Fines loomed, and the board scrambled to overhaul their approval process, suddenly obsessed with transparency and compliance. Meetings that once felt like Patricia's personal court were now open forums, with neighbors actually speaking up. The tyranny of her clipboard was history. Patricia's yard looked like a war zone. Backhoes tore up her illegal swale, and hazmat crews in yellow suits carted away contaminated soil. For sale, signs sprouted like weeds, her dream of neighborhood royalty buried under a mountain of legal bills. Neighbors, finally free from her glare, started chatting with me. Some apologized for staying silent, admitting they'd been too scared of her HOA vendettas to cross her. One guy, a retired mechanic, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You took her down with a poop geyser." That's legend. I just shrugged. All I did was let physics do the talking. The shift was palpable. HOA meetings turned democratic, with actual debates instead of Patricia's decrees. I even got roped into advising on utility and environmental policies, my septic saga making me the neighborhood's reluctant expert. My outlet, the spark of this whole mess, was now capped with a lockbox and a sign screaming, "No unauthorized use, private property," in bold red. A motion sensor floodlight kept watch, just in case anyone got ideas. No more freeloaders. Weeks later, as Patricia's moving van idled outside her house, she shuffled over, looking like she'd aged a decade. She handed me a court-ordered apology letter, her handwriting stiff as her nod. "I regret the misunderstanding," she muttered, the words sour in her mouth. I took the paper, fighting a grin. "Misunderstanding?" I said, leaning on my porch rail. "Patricia, next time, respect people's boundaries, and maybe check where the pipes lead." Her lips twitched, but she turned and scurried back to her van, her reign reduced to cardboard boxes and a one-way ticket out. I used the settlement cash to level up my septic system, new filtration, remote monitoring, the works. I even tossed in some solar panels, cutting my electric bill to pocket change and sticking it to the grid. No more Patricia-sized surprises. My house, once just a quiet spot to crunch data, felt like a fortress of independence. Sitting on my porch one evening, I cracked a beer and surveyed the neighborhood. The air was fresh, no trace of that galanite stench. My electric bill, back to normal, sat on the table, a trophy of victory. Patricia had wanted to be the queen of curb appeal but ended up the duchess of the dung heap, her legacy a cautionary tale whispered at mailboxes and barbecues. She'd learned the hard way, mess with a man's power, and you might get more than you bargained for, especially if his septic system's got a temper. This wasn't just about me, though. It was about every guy who's had to deal with a petty tyrant, whether it's an HOA dictator, a nosy neighbor, or a boss with a god complex. Sometimes, justice comes with a gurgle and a splash, and when it does, it's sweeter than a cold one on a hot day. So, if you loved this tale of septic revenge, smash that like button. Share it with anyone who's ever gritted their teeth at a Karen on a power trip. Subscribe for more stories of entitled folks getting their comeuppance, and ring that bell to stay in the loop. Got your own tale of outsmarting a neighborhood nuisance? Spill it in the comments, I'm all ears.